Hi there, my name is Stephen Schmidt from the Greenwich Library. I'm talking to novelist and poet Quan Barry, whose latest novel, We Ride Upon Sticks, came out on March 3rd from Pantheon Books. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with me today.
Yay, fabulous. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So to start us off, please tell us a bit about the book.
Fabulous, yeah. So We Ride Upon Sticks, which is this book right here, is my second novel, and it's actually set in my hometown of Danvers, Massachusetts. So Danvers, Massachusetts, back in 1692, was actually part of Salem. It was actually the part of Salem called Salem Village. And in Salem Village is where a lot of the incidents happened that sparked the Salem witch trials. And so in thinking about We Ride Upon Sticks, basically what I've written is a book that is set in 1989 in the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, and we follow the high school girls varsity field hockey team as they try and make it to the state championship in Worcester. And basically along the way, they sort of turn to the darker arts, i.e. magic, witchcraft, those kinds of things, in order to have a winning season. So again, the book, like I said, is set in my hometown, and it follows the girls as they try and use witchcraft to make it to the state championship.
So when I describe this book to people, I describe it as a cross between Heather's and Rosemary's Baby. Does that work?
It does, yeah.
First question is, did you play field hockey?
I did. So there are certain liberties, obviously, I took with the book. One of them is the fact that our field hockey team actually was really good. In this book, it starts off, the field hockey team is kind of a bad news bears situation, they're lovable losers kinds of things. But in the town of Danvers, when I was growing up in the 80s, the field hockey team had a really strong tradition each year of creating and having amazing players. We had a really strong coach. And so, like I said, that part of the book is definitely fictional. But so I grew up playing field hockey. I started playing when I was in 7th grade, and I played all the way through my senior year.
As you mentioned, the book takes place on the North Shore of Massachusetts, where you grew up. Why did you decide to keep it local, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. When I was first considering writing this book, I had actually thought about setting it in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was important to me because I knew that the history of the Salem witch trials was going to be an aspect of the book. And so I thought, well, I'll set it in Salem. People know Salem. The actual town mascot for the football teams and all the sports teams in Salem is actually the witches. And so I was considering going that route. And then I talked to a friend of mine who's also from the North Shore of Boston, and I was telling her what my ideas were for the book. And she was like, well, why don't you just set the book in Danvers where all that stuff actually happened? And I said, yeah, but nobody actually knows Danvers. I have to explain all this stuff. And she's like, well, yeah, why don't you explain the history of Danvers? And when she said that, it just like a light went off in my head in a good way, because I realized that I grew up in the 1980s in Danvers. I had all that knowledge. I knew what the layout of the town looked like. I knew the references to various places. I would have had to have done a lot more research if I actually set it in Salem. And so setting it in Danvers allowed me to explore aspects of the 1980s I had kind of forgotten, but I managed to remember them in a certain kind of way because I actually lived that. So the reason to set it in 1989, it's true, I didn't have to do a lot of research for this book at all, because in many ways I sort of lived it. And I also felt that putting it in a specific place and a real place, everything in the book is 100% factual, with the one exception. The book opens there in New Hampshire at the University of New Hampshire campus for a field camp. There are a couple of places there that are made up, but everything else is 100% factual. So for example, when my copy editor was going through the book, there were times when, for example, I accidentally had the wrong name for the local bowling alley. And she'd be like, no, it's Sunny Lanes, not Sunny Vale. Or she would tell me, no, the local sports store was actually called Coleman's, not MVP, or you know what I mean? So I felt like giving it that level of authenticity. I think it comes through to the reader that in that sense. And it just kind of adds, I think it adds to the magic of the book, because it's the idea that they're real places. And so then you kind of start to think like, well, gee, how much of this could have happened, and those kinds of things. So
it really does ground you to a certain space as well as a certain time. Now, as you mentioned, it's Danvers is right next door to Salem, so to speak. So and a bit of the history regarding the Salem witch trials, plays a part in the book. What is it about that particular part of history that still resonates so sharply today?
So it's true. It's for me, I grew up about a mile away from the Rebecca Nurse house. Rebecca Nurse was the woman who was the oldest person during the witch trials who was hung. She was probably in her 70s or 80s. That whole story has always resonated with me because I've always been like, what would I have done? It's the question of like, if you just confess to being a witch, they would show mercy on you and you wouldn't be hung. But if you didn't, if you kept your honor intact, it was the idea that you were sent to the gallows. And I've just always been, I think it's just such an interesting idea that people chose to keep their honor intact and to be hung. So that's something that I've always been interested in. The second thing that I've always been interested in is just teen girls and what teen girls will do when they're in a mass, right? And so a lot of sports books that are written are usually about teen boys or about football, Friday Night Lights, or it's about basketball or what have you. Usually if girls are depicted in sports, it's things like ice skating or gymnastics or those kinds of things,
Or cheerleaders.
Exactly. And so I was interested in looking at team sport, but with women. Obviously, the women's soccer team is doing really well, the national women's soccer team. And so I thought it's time to look at girls in sports and see what happens. And so I was interested, I think there's a lot of parallels. The women of Salem Village in 1692 did not have a lot of options available to them. They probably could either be work in somebody's household or they would be mothers and wives. And that was really about it for them. And so I thought about what would happen if you took those same women, those same girls, and set them 300 years beyond 1692. What kind of options would they have available to them? What kinds of things would they do? How would they try and find their voices? And so that whole idea has always really percolated with me about teen girls and how just time can really change what kinds of options they have available. So again, it's the exact same landscape, basically, that the girls of 1692 are living in, but obviously the girls of 1989, it's a much different world.
Speaking of 1989, that is where the book takes place, and it's full of cultural references and touchstones from the time. I think it'll make certain readers very nostalgic for that period in time. There's a lot of references to music and movie stars. How did you choose which references to use, and were they significant to you, or were you looking for more something of a universal moment?
Mm-hmm. So it depended. So for example, I'm not giving anything away, but over time, the girls begin to refer to the dark power that they're using as Emilio, as in Emilio Estevez. And people have asked, so what made you decide to, use Emilio as being the heartthrob who is on the cover of this notebook where they make their dark pledges? And I decided at the time, this is kind of a little bit based in fact, is I had a friend who had 2 celebrity crushes back in the 1980s. And so her one crush was obviously Emilio Estevez. And her other crush, I came to realize in many ways wouldn't have worked for the book because we all still know who he is. At the time, we didn't know how to pronounce his name, but it was basically, we used to call him Keanu Reeves, right? So if you think about it though, Keanu Reeves is still with us and very much has a career. So it wouldn't have made a lot of sense to have him be this sort of throwback heartthrob in certain kinds of ways. As far as other things, a lot of it does come from a place of truth. So for example, there was a song, the song that's featured in the book called Look Out for Number One, which actually is a song from the movie Staying Alive, which was the sequel to Saturday Night Fever. And it's true that our coach had that song on tape and we would listen to it before every game. We would pump ourselves up and listen to that song. And for people who don't know that song, it's a classic 80s song. You're gonna wanna listen to it when you're on the Stairmaster. It's really great.
That brings me to a related question. Did you have put together a playlist for this book by any chance?
I didn't, no.
I think there's a lot of mileage there because there's a lot of good things you could just put on there.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the book too. And I was so for example, in the galley, there's actually, there are lyrics from Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. And when it came time though to actually buy the rights to use that song, it kind of makes sense, but it turns out that Bruce Springsteen does not sell the rights to that song at all. And it makes sense because you can see that maybe people would try and use it for commercial purposes or various kinds of things. So he just does not sell the rights to that song. And so I was only allowed then to include just 2 lines of the song, and I had to take the rest of it out.
It does seem like some politicians have taken liberties with that song already without his okay. One of the really interesting parts of the book for me is there's a lot of racial and gender undertones that are subtly explored in the book. Mm-hmm. And this is a time when identity wasn't really talked about too much. Why do you think that was?
So a couple of things. It's true. It was a different time. And one of the reasons why I wanted to set the book in 1989 was to rethink the 80s. I think it's easy for people nowadays to think back on those John Hughes movies and just to be like, oh, it was funny music and funny hair and we wore bright colors and everybody did the safety dance, or, and that's how people remember the 80s. But the 80s definitely had a darker side to it, right? I mean, it's the time of the Central Park Five. It's the time of the AIDS crisis. It's post-Reagan. It's not necessarily morning in America for everybody. And obviously when you do watch some of those John Hughes movies, they don't sit well. I actually rewatched Prince's Purple Rain, which I hadn't seen in years. And in that movie, he's very abusive to his girlfriend, the character that he plays, and in a way in which nobody questions it. It's just what happens. It's not questioned. And so I wanted to go back and think about the 80s and question those kinds of things, because we didn't have the kind of consciousness then that we have now. And so it was important to me to rethink some of the things that you're bringing up. I like to make the joke that in some ways I feel like the book is actually sort of like a green smoothie. And what I mean by that is that when you make a green smoothie, you have your spinach in it, and that's sort of the social criticism that's present in the book. But then you also have, your apple and your banana and your mango, which makes it palatable, right? And so even though the book does have a lot of social criticism in it, I'm hoping that the humor presents it in such a way that people are like, oh yeah, things are being criticized and I can be critical of that and rethink it. And yet I don't feel like I'm being preached at. It's funny. It's still enjoyable for me to read and rethink these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I don't think it was didactic at all. I do think that a lot of what the cultural enlightenment that some of the characters underwent really serves a larger purpose of empowerment. And I think the book, to me, is a lot about empowerment. But just to go back to something regarding some of the issues, is that, we get a feeling from some of the characters that these issues, as far as being a minority or being of mixed heritage, it was simmering for a while with some of those characters, especially in the case of AJ and Sue. So I think that part of this, they had an awakening or awareness because of what happened with the team.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very true. I think that, and again, the idea that they sign their names in this book, and gradually it's not just that they're winning, that they want to make it to the state championship, but they come into who they truly are, and it allows them to have a voice in certain kinds of ways, and to even want better things for themselves that maybe they didn't even realize that they had wanted, And so in thinking about some of the minority characters, and there's also LGBTQ characters in the book too,
right.
Very much it's, they're coming of age and they're coming into awareness of who they are and what it means to be in this space and what it means to be a person of color or an LGBTQ person in these spaces, and how to just negotiate that and navigate those spaces, particularly during a time in which, again, the world is not woke.
Yeah. And it also seemed that during the course of, their win streak and their empowerment, these sort of issues that may have been bubbling under with them personally sort of came to the forefront because of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's definitely something that I kind of remember. I remember, again, the town of Danvers at the time when I was there was overwhelmingly white, like 95% white. It's not like that anymore necessarily. So a lot of the issues presented in the book are things that I remember growing up, is that when we played other teams, most of the teams that we played were teams that were majority white. And I have a memory though of occasionally when I would play games, people thinking like, oh, she's a black girl. Oh, ooh, she's going to be good. Just like these assumptions that other players would make. I could tell that they were making about me, that I was better than I necessarily was. You know what I mean? So a lot of the issues that a lot of the characters of color face in the book are things that I remember at the time.
Yeah, there's an incident in the book specifically about what you're talking about with one of the characters. So despite it being a comic novel at its heart, the main message that I take away from the book was one of empowerment. I mean, these girls became different people once they started to believe in themselves and once they started to believe in each other. Is that what you hope the reader takes away from the book besides being entertained?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. In many ways, my sister was kind of giving me a hard time about it because I made this comment somewhere that in many ways, when we were growing up, a word that we would hear from time to time from our mother or from our grandmother was the word ladylike, and it was always true. It'd be like, oh, that's not ladylike. And I remember even in the 80s, thinking like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is ladylike? If that's if something was ladylike, I always remember thinking I didn't want to be ladylike, you know? And in many ways, I sort of see this as the anti-ladylike book. You know, like these girls are trying very hard, although they're not necessarily conscious of it, but of trying not to be ladylike. And so I do think ultimately it's a message of empowerment. I would also say that I actually, you know, before all the things happen in the world and why we're, you know, now in our homes talking to each other, but I actually got a chance to go back to my hometown and to go back to my high school. And it was amazing. So a lot of my friends from the field hockey team came out to the reading that I gave in my hometown in Danvers. And it's the idea, you know, it's been 30 years since I've seen some of these people, and yet the bond is still so strong. There's something about team sports, you know, we all like still like each other. You know, we're talking about, like, this is again before the world sort of changed, you know, we're talking about getting together this summer and maybe hitting around a few balls or what have you, right? So there was a way in which field hockey, the sport, you know, it helped us realize things about ourselves. It helped us make friendships. And I hope that comes through in the book, you know, just that like, these girls, you know, they have their issues with each other, but they're ultimately at the end of the day, like they're all friends and they're all still friends 30 years from now. And that's basically like the truth.
And I have a question regarding something that occurs a few times within the book. It has to do with body characteristics, now, such as a specific hairstyle or a body mark. And in the book, these are almost portrayed as characters with a mind of their own. Can you explain a little bit about that?
I think so. Yes, there's a handful of characteristics that do become almost sentient in certain kinds of ways and that become characters. I think when I was first thinking about it, when I was first writing them, it was simply because there's 11 characters in the book. So there's 11 members on a field hockey team. And I knew going in that I was going to have to really work to differentiate each character. You know, most books, you know, when I'm telling my students how to write a novel, I'm like, you only want to have like one main character or what have you, right? The idea of having 11, in hindsight, I'm not sure, like, how do you have 11 main characters? And so in the beginning, it was just sort of a survival thing. I was just trying to really make them different. And one way to do that was to have, again, physical characteristics help differentiate the characters. But then, you know, as I progressed pretty quickly, the character of the Claw, who you meet in the very first chapter, which is a hairstyle, which over time becomes more and more sentient and has opinions and maybe talks or what have you. I came to think of that particular attribute, and maybe for all of them, now that I think about it, it's almost like that attribute is the character's id. You know, it's like the real, it's like we all say one thing, but the subtitles underneath us say something else. And so again, the character's hairstyle can speak her truth in a way in which maybe she can't. And so it kind of makes sense that by the end of the book, maybe they don't need to have these characteristics anymore because they can speak their own truth. You know, they don't need to have it moderated through the lens of a hairstyle.
Or an overbearing jaw, or a mark on your neck.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Another question I had about the book is, why was the narrator never referenced? And I hope that's not a spoiler.
And we'll see. And so the book is written in a first-person plural voice. Some of the more famous first-person plural novels, one of the most famous ones is The Virgin Suicides, so by Jeffrey Eugenides. In that book, you get a group of teen boys who are watching a family of girls, and so it's the teen boys who tell the girl's story. So when I was writing this book, I knew that I wanted it to be a first-person plural book, and I didn't know, though, who the first-person plural was going to be. At first, I thought it was actually going to be a group of freshman girls. So when you play a sport, there's usually a freshman team, a junior varsity team, and then a varsity team. And there's a way in which oftentimes freshman girls idolize the senior girls. Like they know everything about them. They know what kind of sticks they use, what kind of cleats they're wearing. But when I started to write the book like that, I realized it became very hard for me to explain why these freshman girls would know certain things, like why they would have been in certain spaces with the senior girls. Then I thought for a while that maybe the collective voice belonged to the school and the whole school was telling the story. And then I realized that didn't quite work either. And then I decided that it was just the team itself. And so the joke that I make is that there's no I in team. You know, but I think it also works because it adds a level of sort of witchiness to the book in the sense that it's like a collective mind that's telling the story, because it's collectively, it's their story. And so it allowed me then to have magical, realistic moments where they are collectively hive minding and thinking each other's thoughts and things like that. So, so the voice is, you're right, the voice is never named, but I think that people can make interpretations as to, like, does it belong to the team as opposed to is it just really some third person, just totally unknown, narrator? Hopefully by the end they can see, because by the end, not to give anything away, but I think it almost becomes bigger than that. It's the idea of like what the coven would be, in the final scenes, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, but in the final scenes, it kind of like, it enlarges and it maybe includes like all women or in certain kinds of ways, or it include, so it's like this collective voice that maybe the team started, but again, that it enlarges by the end of the book.
That leads me to my next question. So thank you. So the whole book builds up to this final game, this elite state championship game. And we don't really discover what happened in that game until the final chapter, which takes place 30 years after the rest of the book. Why did you choose to reveal this in that manner? And there's also quite a few other questions that get answered at that point, almost in retrospect.
Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a spoiler alert. So hopefully people have read the book and know that. I'm definitely a writer who I don't plan anything. I like to write myself into a corner and to figure out how I'm going to get out of it. And so I always knew that all season long they were ramping up to this big championship game. And I had to figure out, okay, well, what am I going to do with that game? In many ways, obviously the book is about field hockey, but really field hockey takes up like 10% of the book or less, right? It's really much more about relationships and schools and coming of age and that kind of stuff. Like in many ways, if you actually just had physical descriptions of what happens at a game of field hockey, it's actually very boring. She took her stick, she hit the ball, she ran, that kind of thing. And so I knew I was going to have to deal with the championship game in a non-traditional kind of way. And I just had to figure out what that non-traditional kind of way of talking about it would be. And then as I got closer to the end, I came to realize like, oh, okay, well, because there were so many like loose ends in the air that you want to have tied up. There's each character has their own thread and their own journey that they've been on. And you want to know like, well, what's going to happen with these characters, right? And in many ways, I think it was obvious to me because the end of the season in many ways is not where the end of their personal journeys is, right? And so the end of their personal journeys is actually them as adults, and to see where they've ended up. And so it became evident to me as I was getting closer and closer to that ending that that's actually where the true ending of the book was going to be.
I want to switch gears here for a little bit. Now, you are also a poet. Mm-hmm. So how is poetry writing different than writing a novel?
Yeah, so this is actually my second novel that I've written. My first novel was a book called She Weeps Each Time You're Born. It was a book set in Vietnam. It's a very lyrical book. It's a more, when people use the word like difficult, what that means with work. But I realized a couple of things in writing that first novel is that as a poet, I am very interested in ellipses. And what I mean by that is I am very interested in creating things that the reader has to do work to interpret. In many ways, that's what fuels poetry, right? So poetry, you don't have that many lines to get something done. So you have to rely on your reader to sort of unpack what you've said. If you just write a poem, I'm always telling my students this, if you write a poem and you explain yourself, like you explain everything, then why your reader doesn't have to do anything in that, right? So exploring and interpreting is half the fun of poetry. In many ways, I think the same thing when it comes to fiction. And I'm interested in how we can create spaces in which the reader then has to do interpretive work. So in my very first novel, it's true that the reader has to do a lot of interpretive work. I think in productive ways and in ways that they can. In this novel, it's true that there's less work in that sense that have, interpretive work, but there's some. In the next book that I'm working on, there's a lot more interpretive work again. So for me, in thinking about being a poet, in poetry, I'm always thinking about, again, trying to give less. And in fiction, it's always attention that I know I have to give more in that sense. It's also the idea where, when thinking about poetry, I'm thinking in terms of what kinds of subjects work better for poems and what kind of subjects are better for long form. And oftentimes it just simply has to do with like, if something has, as obvious it sounds, if something has like a narrative thread that you can imagine elongating, For me, most of my poems are not narrative. They tend to be just more lyric pieces that are sound driven or what have you, or imagistically driven. My poetry is much more interested in trauma, surprisingly. So this is a comedic book. my 4 poetry books and my first novel are not comedic in any way, shape, or form. You know, my first novel is about Vietnam, and it's about the trauma of Vietnam, and it takes place in Vietnam. And again, many of my poetry books deal with different kinds of trauma, not my own, but I'm interested in thinking about historical trauma and things like that. So it's kind of strange that this book, you know, sort of comes out of nowhere, but I'm always interested in doing new things. So even if you look at my 4 poetry books, even though they do have certain subjects that they have in common, formally, they're all very different. So I definitely pride myself on always trying to do something different with each book. So my poetry books are all formally very different. And then in thinking about my novels, so again, I have a 3rd one that's mostly complete that I still need to do some things with. But if you look at just the 3 novels, they're also very, very different too. So yeah. I actually, though, at the end of the day, when I was a kid, I just wanted to be a writer. I didn't make distinctions between poet versus fiction writer versus playwright. You know, I just wanted to do it all. And I think in many ways, it's kind of sad to me because I actually tell people that I feel like creative writers are the last generalists left in the academy. And what I mean by that is that in the academy, so at universities, so many people, for better or for worse, are so highly specialized, you know, what they do. And yet as a poet, as a fiction writer, I like to say that I know a lot, but I only know like this much about a lot of things instead of knowing a lot about one subject. So like I said, I know a lot of things, but I only know just a bit about them. And for me, I feel like that's a great honor and a privilege to have that kind of time to do that, to have that kind of knowledge, and to be able to do the kind of research that I need to do for my work.
You know, that's how I describe a librarian too, is that we know a little bit about a lot of things. So just to switch gears again, as I mentioned, your book came out last month, and I'm sure you had big plans to promote it. How have you had to change those plans based on our current world situation?
Mm-hmm. So I actually feel like one of the lucky ones. My book came out March 3rd. And so I started here in Madison, and then I went to New York on March 4th. And then I went to Boston on March 7th. So I was in Boston, and then I went back to my hometown. I went to my high school. I gave a reading in my hometown. And the last event that I did was right before like the governor of Massachusetts declared a state of emergency. And that was probably right around March 11th. So in many ways, I feel like I got to do the things that were most important to me. You know, I got to do this interview on NPR in New York. I got to have a big launch party here in Madison. I got to go back to my high school. I went to my high school, teachers and kids, and everybody was there. And then after I got to do the things that were super important to me, things happened and changed. So I feel actually like that my heart goes out to people whose books have come out like during this. So I feel like I was in a good place. And so since then, it's true that a lot of what I've been doing has been things like this, or I've done quite a few radio interviews through the phone. A lot of it too, I also just did regular old interviews with folks asking me questions who then did write-ups for newspapers or magazines or things like that. So like I said, I do feel very fortunate that timing-wise, I got the important things done. In many ways, though, you know, I have a friend whose book is coming out today called The Coyotes of Carthage. And, you know, we were trying to tell him, and I understand that, you know, he's feeling anxious because his tour has been canceled. The truth is, though, I've found, and in a previous life, I worked in a bookstore. I used to work at a Borders Books on the North Shore of Boston. And my job was putting together, you know, events and those kinds of things. I feel like it's a different world when it comes to book events, that people... In many ways, the reason to do book events in a store is because when you're coming to a store, they'll have you listed in their newsletter. You know, they'll have maybe a special shelf, or they'll have your book, you know, profiled on the special shelf. You know, so there's ways in which for that month you get extra buzz in that particular store. In many ways, though, for a mid-list author like myself, it doesn't mean that I get huge crowds, you know, but it's worth it because I get people, you know, seeing my book listed in the newsletter and that kind of stuff. So we were trying to tell this friend of mine that in many ways, even though he can't go out, you know, what's really most important, you know, are things like radio interviews or newspaper interviews or things like that. I do think there's a way too. I keep getting texts from friends, particularly now because of the space in which we're living in which people really are interested in reading. And I think that my book, fortunately, because it's fun in many ways, like I've gotten a lot of notes being like, your book is just what I needed. You know, people kind of want to tune out, but it's not, you know, again, as we talked about, there's still social commentary in there. So you don't have to feel guilty like you're just reading, you know, like a beach book or something like that. And so I think for a lot of people, they've appreciated having a book that they can read during this time that takes them away, but that again, still challenges them in certain kinds of ways.
So I think that's a really good way to put it. And I think that along those lines, do you think before we leave, you could read us a few lines from the book?
So sure. So this is just a scene. It's like about a page long or so.
Perfect.
A scene from the book. And basically what happens in this scene, so we'll see all of the characters, it's basically their fall pep rally. And so the fall pep rally, usually what happens is the principal comes out, he announces the sports, and then the high school team the football team goes through the big papered hoop first. But as you'll hear at this pep rally, something different happens. And so just two things I'll just mention really quickly. One is that you'll hear a mention of Bert and Ernie in this section. Bert and Ernie are basically these two cops who work the school. And basically that's their beat, is the high school. And the students refer to them as Bert and Ernie because they have a height difference and one of them has a unibrow. And then just one thing I also mentioned for younger viewers is that there's reference to the Budweiser theme song. So I know that younger viewers don't remember that the Budweiser theme song back in the 80s used to be like, when you say Budweiser, you've said it all. And so I know a lot of people are like, wait, what, for younger people who don't remember that. So it's just something to keep in mind. But again, this is what happens at the fall sports pep rally. Then Principal Yoff was standing at the microphone trying to get the student body to shut up. When it quieted down, he said a bunch of stuff about Falcon's spirit, the trophy case outside the main office, the exceptionalism of Danvers High's young men and women, blah, blah, blah. We always wondered if Principal Yoff even liked pep rallies. The guy had a PhD in education from Wisconsin. Did he feel like a tool standing up there in front of the student body yammering on about winning? We felt embarrassed for him when he concluded his speech with his fist in the air and a weak noise that we gathered from context was supposed to be some sort of rebel yell. Bert and Ernie were standing off to the side in their police uniforms. They nodded approvingly at the strange yodeling emanating out of Principal Yoff. We didn't even know why they were there, to show school spirit? But it was probably part of some new initiative to convince us kids that cops were our friends. The thinking being, if we viewed them as allies today, tomorrow we'd be more likely to run to them, narking on our friends when something serious went down. Finally, from there, the rally was pretty unremarkable until the hoop appeared. Karen Burrows and the cheerleaders had just gotten it into position, a big blue falcon painted right in the middle of it, when Jen Fiorenza turned to us and screamed, "Field, field, field." "Hockey, hockey, hockey," we yelled. And before any of us knew what was happening, we were charging the hoop, a herd of water buffalo stampeding on the African plain, Principal Yoff a casualty of our herd mentality, the guy buffeted every which way as we roared past. Jen was the first through, her claw a rhino horn, the paper tearing each of us if we were being born again, only to reemerge in a whole new world, all 11 of us pouring through. Abby Putnam, a ray of light, girl Corey, a woman scorned, Mel Boucher with the dark mark on her neck, boy Corey hoping nobody was looking at him, Becca Bajelica wondering why she hadn't worn a third bra, Sue Yoon with her hair dyed Kool-Aid and Crediberry, A.J. Johnson wondering who among us really had her back, Heather Houston following blindly without her glasses, Julie Kaling like a monarch butterfly on its way to Mexico, little Smitty gnashing madly at the paper with her teeth, be aggressive, be aggressive, the other fall sports falling in line behind us, football bringing up the rear, the marching band blowing their brains out, the cheerleaders screaming along to the Budweiser theme. When you say DHS, you've said it all.
Thank you so much. Thanks again. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. Once again, the book is called We Ride Upon Sticks. It's published by Pantheon Books. So please hop on the Greenwich Library website and check out ebook or the audiobook. And please give our friends at Diane's Books in Greenwich a call and order one if you want. Hang in there, Quan, and many thanks and really appreciate it.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.